Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Talks on Tuesday today. Today, we are going to talk about trauma and early childhood development. My name is Lisa Terry. I am with Virginia's Early Intervention Professional Development Team. We also have Corey Hill, Dana Childress, and Jeannie Schroeder, who is also going to be providing some backup support for our team today. And we're super excited to have Andrea Muffley here with us to present on today's topic. A little bit about Andrea is she is an occupational therapist with Helping Hands. And Andrea, if you want to go ahead and move to your bio slide, just so they can see a beautiful picture of you. Thank you. She's an occupational therapist with Helping Hands. She's also an adjunct faculty with South University. Andrea is also a master trainer in adverse childhood experiences, or the ACEs. Her special interests include sensory processing, self-regulation, infant mental health, trauma, early intervention, and family-centered practices. So I am going to turn it over to Andrea, who will present to you for the next hour. Again, for everyone that's just joining, I just want to say to make sure that your videos stay off during the next hour, and feel free to use the chat box if you have any questions. All right, Andrea, I'm going to go ahead and turn my camera and mute myself, but take it away.
Okay, thank you so much for that great introduction, Lisa. My name is Andrea. I'm excited to be talking to you guys today about trauma. For the sake of video speed, I'm going to turn my camera off too, just so it goes a little bit faster and we don't lose any kind of web connection. We have some big things we're going to talk about during this presentation. Our goals for this part 1 presentation include learning about the different types of stress, learning more about ACEs, those adverse childhood experiences, self-regulation. The hand-brain model will save until next class because we just didn't have time for all of this information. And then we'll go into trauma's impact on global development. Today's presentation, we're going to focus specifically on the birth to 3 population, but trauma's effects last longer than that, so that's something to think about in the back of your mind as we go through this presentation. We're going to focus on its effects on the children we serve, but we want to understand also how it relates to their siblings, their caregivers, and the family system as a whole. But first off, I want to hear how you guys describe trauma. What do you see in the families you serve? You guys can type your answer into the chat, and that will give us kind of a basis for this presentation today. Yes, adverse experiences can be very traumatic. Aggressive behavior can pop up as a result of trauma. Trauma can create those emotional barriers such as stress, short tempers, anxiety. It can create a lot of chaos in the family, causing the whole family system to shift. We can see a lot of those shut down children we see that have difficulty expressing emotions. It might result in some different behaviors than we're used to seeing. And every single family we see that's affected by trauma will show those effects in a different way. Health issues can be a source of trauma or stress. Living through an upsetting experience such as a global pandemic or a deployment can all create trauma within that family system. And all of these different types of trauma affect the children we serve differently. So when we think further into this question and we talk about the brain structures that are specifically impacted by trauma, we can look at this visual up on the screen, because we know that chronic stress or trauma wires the brain for survival. Trauma directly influences our synaptic density and the myelination within those pathways. So it literally changes how we perceive information, how we process it, and how we respond. These changes are lifelong and can impact children 0 to 3 the most significantly, because that is when the brain is pruning for synaptic density and myelination. So we know that the earlier a child has an experience to something, the more it shapes future development. The information starts to come in at that brainstem level, where the trauma can affect blood pressure, breathing, and heartbeat, moving up to the cerebellum, where we move into our gross motor skills of balance, coordination, and it keeps going. Further up into the brain, we see the parietal lobe is affected. So that's where we work on language, sensation, and reading. Those language processing skills are known to be significantly impacted by trauma. The temporal lobe, where we talk about hearing, vision, memory, and speech, is really affected because the brain in trauma mode is actively scanning the environment, looking quickly and not deeply, often missing many of the details the rest of us are seeing when we're not in trauma mode. And carrying all that information all the way up to the frontal lobe, where our brain works on memory, movement, and behavior, those executive functioning skills. All of those different brain structures are significantly impacted by trauma. And these changes are lifelong, starting from birth. ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Study, did an experiment where they categorized 3 different types of ACEs into abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. They found out that these events were significant enough to create toxic stress that negatively impacted childhood development onto their adulthood years. To learn more about this study, I'm going to play a video. It's long, but it's worth it. This study was a longitudinal study, and it goes into so many different details. We're talking about physiology, brain structure, childhood development, and long into adult health. So grab your cup of coffee and let's watch the video to see how these adverse childhood experiences influence the brain, body, and behavior of the clients and families we serve.
A child's experiences early in life are important building blocks for the developing brain. Genes, nature, are like the blueprint. They provide the basic framework for brain development. However, genes do not design the brain completely. Environmental influences, nurture, fine-tune how the brain works by shaping which brain connections get used. Connections that are used more grow stronger and more permanent, whereas ones that do not get much use fade away. Together, genes and the environment build the foundation for all future development. Safe, stable, and nurturing relationships early in life lead to healthy development. But children's brains capture other experiences as well. Stressful events. However, not all stress is bad. Positive stress involves normal childhood experiences, like starting daycare or meeting a new person for the first time. This stress is essential for healthy development because it helps children develop coping skills and confidence. But when stress is frequent, chronic, and uncontrolled, it is toxic to children, especially when they do not have a caregiver to provide support or buffer the stress. Adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, such as abuse, neglect, exposure to intimate partner violence, parental depression or addiction, and poverty, are toxic stressors which could lead to lifelong changes in learning and behavior. ACEs early in development can impact social, emotional, and cognitive functioning, increased risk-taking behavior such as drinking and substance use, and increased risk of disease, disability, and social problems later in life. The question is, How do adverse childhood experiences impact a lifelong development? One of the most important systems in our body is our stress system. It's activated when we experience stress. We become alert, our heart rate increases, and so do our stress hormone levels, cortisol and adrenaline. Our body is ready to react, what is known as fight or flight. A short period of time after the stress is over, or if a child receives support from a caregiver, the stress response turns off and the body returns to a normal state. Adverse childhood experiences create stress responses that stay active, and without the support of a caregiver, the system has difficulty shutting off completely. This constant and prolonged activation can affect immune system functioning and increase the chances of sickness, infection, and disease. Prolonged activation of stress hormones is also toxic to the brain. Certain areas of the brain are more vulnerable to toxic stress, including the executive center, or the brain's control center, an area important for solving complex problems, attention, reasoning, impulsivity, inhibition, and learning. A second area is the emotional center, the brain's alarm system, which is involved in processing and interpreting emotions and the ability to control impulses. The third area is the memory and learning center, the brain's filing cabinet, which plays a major role in learning and the formation and retrieval of memories. Science shows that adverse childhood experiences impact all of these brain centers. Behaviorally, what we begin to see is emotional distress, poor emotion regulation, greater impulsivity, learning difficulties, and physical and mental health problems. More recently, science has begun to look at how ACEs cause changes in gene expression through a process called epigenetics, which helps us understand how nature and nurture interact. Epigenetics causes changes in the way genes work without changing the DNA code itself. This occurs through chemical changes influencing how the code is used. In other words, genes are like the hardware in a computer. They determine the boundaries of what is possible. However, we need an operating system to tell the hardware what to do. Epigenetics is like the operating system directing the function of a gene's DNA hardware. The genes we are born with are the genes that we have for life, but experiences like nutrition, exercise, smoking, stressors, and relationships all affect our biology. Adverse childhood experiences are associated with epigenetic changes related to stress, brain development, cognition, and systems associated with mental and physical health. Changes that happen early in brain development are more likely to be enduring and are possibly passed on to future generations as well. The good news is that positive, supportive relationships at any stage in life can make a difference. However, supporting families and children early on will help prevent many of these negative outcomes. One of the key ingredients for healthy development is having warm, loving, and actively engaged caregivers. This involves promoting serve and return interactions, where caregivers actively and warmly engage with the child, making eye contact, responding to sounds, words, gestures, emotional needs, and sharing experiences like reading and play. Providing programs that support caregivers to strengthen these abilities are the blocks that build healthy foundations for life.
Okay, so I love that video because it talks about all of the different domains of trauma. It talks about how it starts before birth, during birth, and even going into epigenetics. It talks about all of the different systems that trauma affects. So after watching that video, my question to you guys in the chat box is, how does trauma affect a child's development? How do we take all that information we just learned from that video and relay it back into that birth to 3 childhood development? Speech and motor skills, social skills, attachments, regression, delays, developmental delays, impacts overall functioning, global development, neuron development, self-regulation, coping skills, lack of security, decreased confidence, that's a big one. And you guys are right, this has a huge impact that can be mitigated with positive relationships from a trusted adult caregiver or parent figure. And we know that trauma impacts children's growth and development because when we're in that trauma brain state, our amygdala is constantly activated. And our amygdala is kind of what I like to call the bouncer of the brain. It decides what is safe and what isn't. Safe experiences get processed, move up the brain to all those different areas that control our speech, motor, language, and emotional attachment skills. So safe experiences get processed up through the brain, and then they get stored, forming new healthy pathways that our brain can access again and again because our amygdala has decided it's safe. But if our amygdala decides something is unsafe or unfamiliar, and we're constantly activated in that trauma state, where amygdala's only goal is to decide if we're safe or not, if we don't know what's going on or a child isn't sure, they're going to have a really hard time processing new information and new experiences because their amygdala is going to be so set on safety, they'll have difficulty attending to everything else, which can translate into that low frustration tolerance, restricted food, difficulty participating in a preschool setting. A lot of the things that we see with the children we serve can be related back to an overactive amygdala or trauma. But when we think about stress, is all stress bad? No, stress has a purpose. It's our nervous system communicating a need. For the purpose of this talk today, we'll talk about 3 different types of stress: positive, tolerable, and toxic. Positive stress is a brief increase in heart rate, mild elevation in the stress hormones. In the video, they talked about this as starting a new preschool or seeing a new babysitter. Another example you'll see of positive stress is getting a shot or an immunization at the doctor. The child gets briefly stressed, the stressful event happens, they move on. They're buffered by a supportive adult during this process, and their hormone levels return to baseline. Their amygdala is not constantly activated, and it was a brief one-time event that they were able to process and work through. All of those factors, the time of the event, the type of the event, and the fact that it just happened once, creates a positive stress situation for that child. Moving up the ladder, we think about stress getting a little bit more serious. This is what we refer to as tolerable stress. It's a serious, temporary stress that's buffered by a supportive relationship. In this picture, you can see the child is still stressed out, but the dad is staying with the child. He's got his arm around her. He looks a little tired by this tantrum, but he's hanging in there. And that's a big part of the difference between tolerable and toxic stress. The events could be the same, such as switching daycares or preschools, but it's buffered by that relationship, and the child is able to process it, return to their baseline hormone levels, and work through that stress. And having that buffer of that adult supportive relationship is what can keep it at a tolerable level before we move up to toxic stress. When we look at this picture, everyone is stressed out. The child is dysregulated, and so is the father. When we think about toxic stress, we're talking about the prolonged activation of the stress response system in absence of protective relationship. So the difference here between a tolerable stress event and a toxic stress event is a relationship. When the child is able to co-regulate with the caregiver, the same stressor moves down the ladder into tolerable. When the caregiver is able to move in and help the child process what's going on around them, the child's nervous system is allowed to return back to baseline, and their amygdala can turn off and they can move into a rest and relax state so their body can process this trauma, making it tolerable. If the child lacks the supportive caregiver relationship, or maybe the caregiver is overwhelmed too, with either a deployment or a housing insecurity, if it's a stressor that's toxic to the child, usually it's toxic to the adult and their parent relationship also. When the adult's unable to cope, they're unable to help their child cope, and that creates a toxic stress cycle. So when we think about the 3 variables in these levels of stress between all of these events, the differences are in frequency, duration, and support available. Is it predictable? Do I have time to recover and turn off my fight or flight response? That's how we mitigate the effects of toxic stress. But when we're working with the families we serve, how do we prevent positive stress from turning into toxic stress? If you guys have any answers, can you type them into the chat box? I'd love to see what you do to work with your families. Providing support, community resources, supporting the caregiver during the child's development, coaching the parent to increase awareness, using coping strategies that work for the whole family, offer encouragement and compassion, being a reliable support system to the family, coaching the parent on self-care, working with the family to learn how to read the child's cues, providing education to the parent so they know why we're working on stress and how the stress affects their child's development. These are all really great answers. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about with the rest of this presentation. Now that we've gathered our history, we've learned how development's affected by stress, we've learned about the different types of stress. Let's learn a little bit more about how this affects the clients we serve. So we know that stress shapes development. That's something we've all seen with the families we serve. But one thing we don't talk about often enough is that this doesn't just start after they leave the hospital with a newborn baby. This toxic stress can begin in utero at conception. The video talked about this a little bit when they mentioned epigenetics. So the conditions in which the child is in the womb affect the child when they're coming out of the womb. For example, when we look at the child in red on the top of the screen, his early experiences during childhood were those of danger and insecurity. His adaptation to these toxic stressors in his life was to turn on his fight, flight, or freeze system, keeping himself safe from the unpredictable family environment he was growing up in. Translating that into adult functioning, he's set up to survive the worst conditions. His nervous system is primed and ready to go, always looking for what's coming next. Because our brains are built on a use it or lose it system. Each time we learn a skill, a pathway is formed. And each experience or practice myelinates and strengthens that pathway so our brain is quicker to use those same skills that worked previously. So the experiences we have in childhood greatly shape how we adapt to future responses. And if they're not mitigated, can carry over into our adult functioning as well. Because the neurons that fire together wire together. So when we look down at the child in green, her early childhood experiences were those of safety. In the picture, you can see her with her father holding a teddy bear, looking peaceful. Maybe they're reading a bedtime story together. She looks calm and regulated. Her adaptation to these early experiences is looking for people, processing the information around her, and seeing the possibility. She's had the opportunity to explore her early childhood in a safe, nurturing environment. So her adult functioning, she's set up to survive the best conditions. That's what she's had practice with. And she might be more vulnerable in the worst conditions compared to the child pictured in red. When a child's nervous system is seeking safety and security, they're not able to self-regulate. Maslow says that these are the first two needs in the hierarchy towards self-regulation. So when we have a child that isn't sure if their home environment is safe, if their caregiver is safe, if their caregiver can keep them secure, they're going to be constantly seeking that. They might be going up to other babysitters, other children, other adults and asking, are you safe? Who's keeping me safe? That's their first priority. So when they enter a preschool environment, they're not going up to the kids looking for new friends. They're going up to the other kids in their class looking for new enemies. Are you safe? Are you going to keep me safe? That's the question that's firing so often. It kind of stops everything else. They're so focused on seeking safety and security, they're not able to move up the developmental ladder to access those higher level skills such as self-regulation. They'll get there, but first they need to know that they're safe. So when we think about a nervous system that's constantly screaming, am I safe? Our nervous system is overreactive. Our amygdala is constantly turning on, checking for safety and security. We're able to process things quickly as humans in this state and efficiently. We're scanning for danger and moving on. We can think about this when we're running to the grocery store after a full day of work. We might be preoccupied, we might just be focused on one or two things, and it's harder for us to move through that grocery store when we're in a hurry and our brain is in that stressful state, versus if we were going on a lazy Saturday morning and we had all the time in the world. The same task would have really different implications based on where our nervous system is at. Because stress rewires our nervous system, which makes it really difficult for young children to process things. So when we think about how we're processing information, my first thought as an occupational therapist is looking at our sensory system, our sense of sight, hearing, smell, touch, and taste. These are all things young children are really developing. So much of the world is new to them that they're constantly exploring and learning through sensory play. And one of the biggest things I work on with young children is feeding. So that's looking at sight, smell, touch, and taste. So, and a lot of young children thinking about unfamiliar foods, they get pretty nervous. They're not sure what it is, and they're not sure what they're supposed to do with it. So we explore this through a lot of different sensory play. My question for you guys is, how does trauma affect a child's ability to process new information? What sensory systems do you think might be impacted for a child who's constantly looking for safety? You can type your answers into the chat. on edge, on alert. And if their basic needs aren't being met, the child is preoccupied. The whole body and nervous system is impacted. And if we're thinking that everything might be a threat, avoidance of new things can make sense. New sights, smells, tastes, and touch. If we don't know what it is, and our body is in fight, flight, or freeze, we don't know what it is. We're going to take that new item, run away from it, push it off of our high chair, never try it again. If it's new, it's not safe. This can make us seem inattentive to what's going on. And it can also create a mistrust or hyper use of our senses. Trauma can cause a child to spend their time constantly elevated, and the buffer between that base state and their threshold of panic is much smaller, so something slightly different will send them over the edge, easier than a child with a more typical base state. Thank you, Jeffrey. That's a great insight. You guys touched on a lot of really interesting parts of how our nervous system is wired and how that can create a lot of avoidance, especially in young children that don't have the verbal skills to communicate. That's new, I've never seen it before. Instead of running away, having a tantrum, hiding behind a familiar adult. These are all different ways that a child's nervous system is impacted by trauma. But when we think about trauma and its effect on development, the slides we've covered are just the tip of the iceberg. And already it can be really overwhelming to think about how we're adequately addressing that with all the families we serve. I like to break it down. I like to choose the one thing that the families are seeing on the surface. We call that our surface emotion. In this picture, you can see this visual of an anger iceberg. The anger is at the tip of the iceberg. It's our surface emotion. That's the visible behavior we're able to see. It could look like a tantrum. It could look like kicking. It could look like a lot of different things. But underneath the surface, it's blank. That's because I use this as a worksheet when I go visit families and I hear about all the concerns they're having with their child adapting to these new environments. What we see is just the tip of the surface, and what's going on underneath takes some detective work, especially with young children. Because we know that stress rewires our nervous system, which makes it difficult for young children to truly process their below the feeling surface. So we might actually have to dive under that surface and figure out, why is that child angry? What happened before? How did their anger surface? And why do you think this set them off? What's going on? And when we get the families actively engaged in that detective work, that problem solving with us, that's when we're able to pull all of this information together. We know how the trauma is affecting their development, but we don't know what the family has seen throughout the week. So together we meet in the middle and we start to fill in the bottom part of this worksheet with the family's hypotheses, with ours, and together we can work through until we're able to pinpoint what's really going on. And that's how we come up with the solutions. So let's tackle this one together. How many of you guys have ever worked with a child and their complaint of the week is, this child is throwing everything? I know that's something I see a lot. So we're going to use that anger iceberg model. We're going to put throwing at the tip of this iceberg. And I'm going to have you guys type in the chat what's going on below the surface. What may be the underlying cause of throwing? Attention seeking, frustrated, scared, emotional pain, hungry, trying to stop the parents from fighting, can't communicate with words, trying to show us with gestures. It could be a physical ache or pain, like a stomach ache or headache. The child could be upset, saying, "You didn't give me what I wanted." It's a gesture the kiddo can control when they're upset. They can easily communicate with the adults around them to show them, "I'm upset," or "I'm tired, I'm not feeling well, I'm not understanding what you're asking." Those are all great hypotheses as to why the child is throwing. And yeah, even something as simple as, "I don't like this toy, get it out of my space," or "I don't know how to turn on this toy and play with it, but I know that it's fun to throw." There are a million different reasons for throwing. And when we're invited into a family's home to address this behavior with a child, we have to do this detective work, or else we're never going to get to the bottom of this. So when we bring in their caregiver or parent and talk this through together, we might be able to find out, "Oh, well, you know what? Baby sister's been teething this week. She's been crying a lot. So maybe my child throwing toys was a way to get more attention this week," or communicate that he was upset with the loud noise his baby sister was making all of a sudden. And that's when we start to pull in that background information we can use to guide our sessions and come up with appropriate coping strategies to mitigate the throwing. Because if we don't know the cause of it, we don't know how to treat it. Great job on that activity, guys. Let's do it again. Let's figure out biting. If biting is our surface behavior, what might be the underlying cause? Sensory seeking, teething, difficulty communicating, was told no. Yes, that definitely is a reason to bite. Wants a toy someone else has. Trying to communicate with biting instead of words. It is the most effective way to get what you want when another child has a toy. It is an effective means of communication, unfortunately. Defending ownership, seeking the reaction of the adults around them. These are all good potential reasons for biting. And especially in a daycare setting when there's a lot of children around, getting the other kids to leave you alone, that defensive mechanism of biting is quick. It works really, really well. So when we're thinking of our fight, flight, or freeze brain trying to get us the quickest, safest response, biting is one of the first ones to pop up. You bite someone, they instantly back away. You've met your goal. Now, how do we figure out how to retrain that? When we've identified the surface emotion, we can start to figure out how we can teach the child other less painful ways to communicate what's going on. And a lot of what you guys were talking about in the chat, we were really looking at, why is the child doing this? What's going on? You guys had your detective hats on and you were ready to start problem solving. That's going to move us into our next few slides where we talk about self-regulation. Contrary to what people talk about when we learn about self-regulation in school, when we learn about it online, when we work with other professionals about it, we think self-regulation is a skill we all have. It's not. Self-regulation is not a skill we are all born with. Self-regulation is a skill that is taught and refined over time. And unlike a regular skill where we start and we slowly move up the ladder, self-regulation is an equation. When we take the task demands and divide them over the child's skills and resources, That's where we get our equation for self-regulation. So when we're thinking about the demands that are placed on the child, we need to compare it to their skills and their resources to meet these demands. If they don't have the developmental skills or the resources available, they won't be able to meet these task demands, and their self-regulation is going to look like it's not age appropriate. But maybe it's not their self-regulation. Maybe it's that the task demands were too high, or we didn't scaffold the activity appropriately. So when we're thinking about self-regulation, keep the equation theory in mind. Task demands over a child's skills and resources. That's how we find self-regulation. However, self-regulation changes over time too, just like all areas of development. We start with caregiver regulation, moving up into caregiver cued regulation. When the cues between the infant and caregiver get solidified, they move into a state of co-regulation. And from 18 months onward, they enter a state of guided self-regulation, where the toddler is slowly learning how to self-regulate throughout their daily experiences. So, what age do you think children are able to self-regulate? You can type your answers into the chat. Varies from child to child, depending on the situation. 3, 10, starting at 6 months. 8. Ooh, when they have the language skills to process the frustration. 5. These are all really good guesses, guys. Okay, I'm not going to keep you waiting anymore. We're going to look at that chart and we're going to go over it again, because depending on the child, all ages can learn some basic self-regulation skills. You guys are right. When the foundations are laid, we're working on self-regulation. So let's look at that chart again. From 0 to 3 months, caregiver regulation. Let's think about what that means. An infant at this stage, from 0 to 3 months, they're dependent on their caregiver. They're dependent for sleep, food. All of their needs at this point are being dictated by their caregiver. They don't have any visible cues, any auditory cues. They're completely dependent on their caregiver for regulation. From 3 to 6 months, when their developmental skills increase, they're able to coo, they're able to look, they're able to gesture a little bit. When the infant's able to participate just a little bit, they're able to give cues to their caregiver, moving up a tier into that caregiver cued regulation. From 6 to 18 months, those cues get more and more intense. The infant starts talking, starts walking, starts getting into things, starts really pulling items down to show to the caregiver. They enter that state of co-regulation, where the infant really has a say in what's going on and can communicate a lot more actively with their caregiver. That's how they enter co-regulation. But then from 18 months and upward, this chart stops. It leaves us hanging at guided self-regulation. And that's our answer. Self-regulation is a skill that's taught over time. We have really different expectations for all of these age groups. If we do something to upset a toddler, they might start screaming, throw themselves to the ground, have a full-blown tantrum. And that would be okay. From a self-regulation standpoint, that would be pretty expected. If we told a school-age child no, they might have a bit of a meltdown and say no and act pretty upset. But they're not going to throw themselves to the ground. It won't be the end of the world like it would be with a toddler. When they enter adolescent years and we tell a teenager, no, they might get pretty mad. They might storm away, walk off, but they're probably not going to have a tantrum. And when we tell an adult no, they're going to be a little mad, but they'll probably say, okay, thanks for trying, and walk on. They'll process it more quickly, more efficiently, because they have more foundational skills, more executive functioning skills, more emotional regulation skills to process this. They've had more experience being told no also. So when we think about the task demands and the skills and resources, adults have the most. So out of all of these age groups, they should be able to self-regulate the best if they have all of the resources and all of the skills available to them. So when we're thinking about self-regulation, we want to think about co-regulation. What are we doing as the trusted adults in this child's life? What are we doing to help them co-regulate? What skills are we modeling? What breathing techniques are we using? What soothing voice can we use when they're upset so that they learn from an early age that they can trust an adult to help them process their feelings? And that will help lay a firm foundation for self-regulation. But how does self-regulation work during a meltdown? Are they still regulated if they're in a meltdown? Doesn't look like it. They look regulated when they're down at the bottom of this bell curve on the left side of this chart. Regulated when they're at their baseline or their full capacity. This is the best place for children and adults to be able to process information. They're fully ready to learn. Their fight or flight system is off. They're ready. But if a triggering thing happens, if they lose a favorite toy or get told no, they might start to move up this bell curve and enter into a state of dysregulation. So when the child is dysregulated, their amygdala sounds the alarm. The alarm is sounding. They are looking for safety. They are having a hard time processing anything because the amygdala actually turns off the language center in your brain so that other areas of your brain can be activated for a fight or flee situation instead of talking. And that might be why you see more screaming, trying to find words, all of those phases of a tantrum is because the language center of our brain is shut off at this point. So when the triggering event or being told no goes away or gets a little bit of time, the child starts to move down this bell curve from dysregulated into a cool down period. You can see that this part of the graph is a little bit more smudgy. It might not always be a slide down. It might be more of a back and forth, and it might spike a few more times because the cool down is a slow recovery process. It's preparing the brain to return to baseline. But we know that for children who are wired for trauma, their baseline is much higher. And it might take longer to return because they're used to their amygdala being activated for longer periods of time. So those tantrums or periods of dysregulation might also last for a longer period of time. This bell curve is another model I like to use when I work with families because it's something I can quickly draw on a piece of paper. And then we can talk about what happened before, what happened at the peak of the meltdown, and what does the cool down phase look for the child. Then I turn the diagram over to the parent and I say, how do we support your child during this meltdown? Under regulated, we write down little blurbs of what it looks like. They're calm, they're breathing, they're in their own space. Dysregulated, I'll have them label also. It might look like kicking, screaming, throwing. That way I'm able to pinpoint when they're at the height of this dysregulation. And then I'll have the parent describe what the cool down process looks like. Is this a child that likes hugs? Is this a child that likes their own space? And then when we have all of those different variables identified, so the parent and I are working towards the same goal, with this child, I'll have them draw on here. Where do I support a child during a meltdown? I'm going to have you guys do that with a stamp tool. So reach up to the top of your screen, click on the little pencil icon that says annotate. Little box will pop up with a stamp. You guys can select a stamp and put it on the screen to tell me, where do we support a child during a meltdown? Whoa, you guys are fast stampers. Okay, so I'm seeing stamps all over this bell curve. And you guys are all right. Because we need to support a child when they're regulated, dysregulated, and cooling down. As the trusted adult in this child's life, we need to show them that adults are available for support and co-regulation no matter how the child's feeling. They can reach out for support when they're calm, and they can reach out for support when they're upset. And when they're cooling down and not quite sure how they're feeling, they can reach out to us too. The ways in which we support them might look a little bit different, but we'll go into that more during part 2 of this webinar. Then when you guys go up to the top, make sure you turn off that annotate feature. So we learned a lot about trauma and how we can understand these principles and apply it to the work we do with our birth to 3 families. My request for you guys is that you take this model and you teach it. Help caregivers understand the regulation cycle. Help caregivers learn to pinpoint where their child is at so that you can learn when to intervene. And help caregivers understand the physiology of their toddler's developing emotions, because there's a lot to work through when we're talking about trauma in young children. Up next, we will meet again on November 10th for part 2 of this webinar, where we are going to dive into how we can use these strategies and apply them to our work we do with our families.
Thank you, Andrea, so much. You have my brain stirring with information and thinking about how we're identifying and using this information with families. I just want to let everyone know, thank you for joining us. You will receive a survey. Oh, there you go. Thank you, Jeannie, for posting that in the chat box. If you click that survey and complete it, then you will receive a certificate. And just remember, next month in November, when we have our second part 2 Talks on Tuesday, it is not going to be on our typical first Tuesday of the month. This will actually be on the second Tuesday. So just make sure you have that down. That's November 10th. You are already automatically eligible after you, if you already registered for today, just so you know that. I'd also say to go ahead and check out our social media pages. We post a lot of different resources and coming up information for resources, any kind of events that are coming up. And you can follow us on Facebook, you can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, or YouTube. And yes, the time is 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern time. And I'm going to, there you go. I just posted all of our social media links in there for you. So thank you again, everyone. Thank you, Andrea, so much. We super appreciate all of the hard work that you put into this. And we'll see everyone for part 2. If you have any questions, go ahead and type them in the box.